Let's take a look at number 1. So here it's asking us for domain, range, the intervals of increasing, decreasing, and constant. So for domain, remember we are only looking at the x values. So we want to see what's our smallest x value that our graph goes to. -7. Bless you. Would it be a bracket or parentheses at -7? A bracket because it's a closed circle. Yes. And then we want to see what's our largest x value that our graph goes to. So what's the point farthest to the right that our graph goes to? That would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Would 9 get a bracket or parentheses? Parentheses because it's an open circle. Perfect. Range, we look at the y values. The only time that we look at the y values is for the range. So we start at the very bottom and then work our way to the top. What's the first y value that our graph touches? -3. Bracket or parentheses? Bracket because it's a closed circle, so bracket -3. And then what's our largest y value that our graph goes to? 7, perfect. Bracket or parentheses? Parentheses because it's an open circle at that point 7. All right, remember for increasing, decreasing, and constant, we are always just looking at the x values. So if you want to, for these, you can cross off the entire y axis. You do not look at the y. We're only looking at the x values. And we always just use parentheses. So it doesn't matter if it's an open or closed circle. Increasing, decreasing, and constant is always just parentheses. So just like how we read going from left to right, we read a graph going from left to right. If you want to start all the way at the left and then just work your way one interval at a time, would I start walking uphill or downhill? Downhill. So I'm decreasing from what value to what value? -7 to -4. Perfect. So that would be decreasing from -7 to -4. So at -4, I start walking uphill till what value? To -2. Perfect. So from -4 to -2, I'm increasing. Then I'm constant from -2 to what? To 3. So constant from -2 to 3. Then at 3, what do we start doing? Decreasing to what value? Awesome, 6. So we are decreasing from 3 to 6. And then at 6, we start increasing again. To what value? 9. So I put the U, I'm increasing from 6 to 9. If you need to, you can always just look and see where you're decreasing first. Just do one thing at a time. Start with where you're decreasing. Write those 2 intervals down. Then go to where you're increasing. Write those 2 intervals down. If you want to bring colored pencils for the test tomorrow, that's perfectly fine too if that helps you see things a little bit better. Just remember for increasing, decreasing, and constant, you are only looking at the x values. Only those numbers for your intervals. Let's look at number 3. So the first thing number 3 asks us is to evaluate a couple values here. So it's asking for f of -4. Remember the number inside tells us what x to look at? And we want to give the y when x is that value. So we're going to go to where x is -4. And what's our y value when x is -4? 5. Then let's do the same thing for f of 2. I'm going to go to where x is 2. And what's our y value at that point? 3. And then let's find the rest of it. The next page asks for the domain range, increasing, decreasing, and constant. So domain, we're looking at our x values. What's our smallest x value that our graph touches here? -4. Bracket or parentheses? Bracket, because we have a closed circle. What's our largest x value that our graph goes to? 4. And do we have any gaps in our x values here? No. We do see that we have a little gap here, but it overlaps a little bit. We have the open circle and closed circle, so it still has a value at that number, so we don't have any gaps in our x's. So that would be -4 to 4, both with brackets. Now let's do our range. Range, we're looking at the y values. What's our smallest y value that our graph goes to here? 0. Our smallest y value's down here at 0. That would be a bracket 0. Then what's our largest y value? 5. And that would also get a bracket. Even though this has an open circle, this one has a closed circle here, so the closed circle means that we still include 5, so it gets a bracket. Any questions on the domain and range here? All right. Increasing, decreasing, and constant. So let's start all the way at the left of our graph and work our way to the right. Am I walking uphill or downhill as I go to the right? Downhill until what value? 0. So from what to what am I decreasing? -4 to 0. Remember, these are always parentheses. At 0, we start going uphill. So it'd be increasing till what value? To 2. So we're increasing from 0 to 2. And then at 2, we kind of have to jump up top a little bit. But then what am I doing? Decreasing. So I'm decreasing from 2 to what? 2 to 4. So I'd put OU, because I have 2 parts to the decreasing, 2 to 4. So anytime you have 2 parts to either your domain, range, increasing, decreasing, or constant, you want to put a U. Do I have any parts here where I'm constant? No, so I would just write none. All right, let's take a look at number 6, and let's graph our piecewise function now. So for graphing piecewise, always treat it as 3 if it gives you 3 separate pieces, 3 separate parts. So 3 separate little graphs. So let's start with the first one. If I have a negative x squared, what do we know that the shape of this graph is going to be? A parabola. Is it going to open up or open down? It opens down because the x squared is negative. So I know that it's going to be a upside down parabola. So that helps me know the shape, so I kind of know how many points, how many numbers I have to plug in until I get that shape. So I'm going to make a little chart up here. What's the first number I'm going to plug in going to be? -1. Always plug in the number that's given first. So -1, we have -1 squared plus 3. When you're plugging it in, these equations seem super easy, super small, but just make sure you follow your order of operations. You got to do the -1 squared before you distribute that negative to it. A lot of people just want to turn it into a plus right away, but -1 squared would be +1. That negative outside keeps it a -1. And -1 plus 3 is 2. So my first point would be -1, 2. So I'm going to go to my graph. Do I have an open circle or closed circle at that point? Closed circle, because it is a less than or equal to. We have a closed circle. So -1, 2, closed circle. Now it's saying that we're using this graph for x values that are less than or equal to -1. So what's another number that's less than -1? -2. So I have -2 squared plus 3. So negative 2 squared would be positive 4, but that negative outside keeps it a negative 4 plus 3. So negative 4 plus 3 would be negative 1. So our point would be negative 2, negative 1. Now everything after the first point just tells us the direction. So it's not really going to be an open or closed circle. It's just another point on our graph that gives us direction. So I'm going to go to the left to negative 2, down to negative 1. And then we can plug in one more point just to be super sure that we know the shape. What's another number I should plug in? Negative 3. Just make sure you're plugging in numbers that are less than negative 1. So we have negative 3 squared plus 3. So this would be negative 9 plus 3, which would be negative 6. So my next point would be negative 3, negative 6. So I'm going to go to the left to negative 3, down, negative 6. Once we have a couple points for our parabola, so if you have a parabola shape, you may need 3 or 4 to kind of see where your graph's going. We can connect our dots. So always start with the number that we started with. So that's where I'm going to put my pencil down first, and then I go through the direction of the other points. All right, let's do our second piece. What's the shape of our second piece going to be? A line, because it's in the form of y equals mx plus b. We see that there's 2 over 2 here. Obviously, 2 over 2 is just 1. I'm going to change it to be 1 over 2. I think that was just a typo. I don't know how the answer key, what they changed it to, but we'll change it to 1/2. So what would we plug in first here? Negative 1. Plug in the numbers that it gives you. For your middle piece, it'll always give you a start and an end. So we can just plug in those 2 numbers. So I'm going to plug in negative 1 first. So I'm going to say 1/2 times negative 1 minus 2. 1/2 times negative 1 would be negative 1/2 minus 2. What do I do to add a fraction and a whole number? What do I need? Common denominator. So I'm going to make it 2 over 1 and change it to be 4 over 2. So this would be negative 5 over 2. So my point here would be negative 1, negative 5 over 2. Where on my graph would negative 5 over 2 be?
Negative 4.
How many times does 2 go into 5?
Oh, 2.
2 times. So it'd be negative 2.5. So if you need to change it to a decimal, that's fine. You need to know where it's going to be on the graph. It doesn't have to be like an exact fraction. Just change it to decimal so you know where you're going to put it. So we go to the left to negative 1 and down 2.5. Is it an open or closed circle at this point? Open circle because it's just a less than sign. So we have an open circle there. Now we know that this is going to be a straight line because we said it's in the form of y equals mx plus b. So I only need 2 points. So what's another number I need to plug in here? 3. It gave us the 2 numbers that we should plug in. So let's plug in 3. So I have 1/2 times 3 minus 2. This would be 3/2 minus 2. I'm going to change the 2 to be 4 over 2. So 3 minus 4 would be negative 1 over 2. So 3, negative 1/2. Do I have an open or closed circle at this point? Open circle. Since it's a key point, it also had a less than sign, so we put an open circle. So I'm going to go to the right 3 and down 1/2. Now that we have 2 points, we can just connect our 2 points with a line. Any questions there? Ready for the third part? All right. So third part, we have a constant negative 4. What shape is this part of our graph going to have? It's going to be a flat line, a horizontal line. If you have a constant, it's just going to be a flat line. Not just a line, but a flat line, horizontal. So technically we don't have an x to plug anything in here, but hypothetically we can kind of visualize to see what our points are going to be. What would be the number that we plug in? 3. So 3. What is my y always going to be? It doesn't matter what we plug in. -4. So my first point would be what? 3, -4. So I'm going to go to my graph, go to the right 3, and down to -4. Is it an open or closed circle at that point? Closed circle, because it's a greater than or equal to. So the right 3 down, -4. Now what's a number for x that's greater than 3? 4. So what would my next point be? 4, -4. So remember, this point just gives me direction. So I'm going to go to the right 4, down -4. So my horizontal line is going to go through that point. So that would be my piecewise function. There wasn't a question like it on the review, but we did some in the notes and in the homework. So I'm going to use number 5 as an example. But sometimes it could give you a piecewise function and ask you to evaluate a certain number. So let's say it asks for f of 6. Given this piecewise function, how would I find f of 6? What would I need to do first? Plug in 6. So which part would I plug in 6 to?
X.
Yeah, but I have so many x's here.
On the ones that show greater than or less than.
Awesome. So which piece does this belong to? First, second, or third?
Third.
The third, because this is the one that's talking about x values that are greater than 3. 6 is greater than 3, so I have to plug it into the third piece. So here I have -3 times 6 minus 2. So -18 minus 2 would be -20. So my answer here would be -20.
You don't have to graph that.
No, unless it says graph. Like, you will have one that you have to graph on the test, but you also have one where it'll just ask you to evaluate. So I just wanted to practice this one evaluating. What if it asks me for f of 3? Which piece would I have to look at here? Why the third one? Awesome, because this one says x values that are greater than or equal to 3. So even this one has a 3 in it, but that's just x values that are less than 3. So if we're looking at something that is 3, we got to look at the one that has the equal to sign. So I would plug it in. I have -3 times 3 minus 2. -9 minus 2 would be -11. So my answer here would be -11. There was some like this in the homework and in the notes. So if you want to practice more, you can always use those for extra practice. For the questions on the bottoms, we're going to do 7, 8, and 10. We want to state the domain of the following using interval notation. So we have to be careful when we have an x in the denominator of a fraction. What can our denominator not be here? 0. So if we have x in the denominator, we have to set it not equal to 0. We also have to be careful if we have a square root. What can we not have under the square root? Negatives. So I would have to set whatever's under my radical greater than or equal to 0. And then also if we have a square root in the denominator, we would set whatever's in our denominator greater than 0, because obviously it can't be 0 in the denominator. Anything else? If we don't have a fraction, don't have a square root, what would our answer be? All real numbers, but how would we write that in interval notation? Negative infinity to positive infinity. All right, so let's look at 7. 7, we have a fraction, so I have to be careful. What do I do when I have a fraction? Set the denominator not equal to 0, which is pretty much the same thing as setting it equal to 0. We just need to find the values there. So we want to solve. How do I solve here? What do I do? So I'm only solving the denominator. We ignore the top. Factor. How do we factor when our leading coefficient is not 1?
Multiply.
Multiply the first times the last, so we get negative 18. What are two factors of negative 18 that add to 7?
9 and negative 2.
Awesome, 9 and negative 2. So x plus 9 and x minus 2. What do we have to do next?
Not equal.
No, before that.
I mean, divide by 9.
Divide by 9. Do not forget, if you start by multiplying, you have to remember to divide by 9. Simplify if you can, so 9 divided by 9 would be 1. If it doesn't simplify, we can move it in front of the x, so that would be 9x minus 2. Does not equal 0. We want to solve these all the way, so now we can set each one not equal to 0. So I have x plus 1 does not equal 0, and 9x minus 2 does not equal 0. So I'm going to subtract 1 on both sides for the first little equation there. So x cannot equal negative 1. Second one, I'm going to add 2. 9x does not equal 2, and divide by 9. So x does not equal 2 over 9. So these are our two values, but we have to write our answer in interval notation. So every other number except negative 1 and 2 over 9 works. So how we would write that would be from negative infinity. Which number is smaller, negative 1 or 2 over 9? Negative 1. So we start with that. Negative 1. So negative infinity to negative 1. We put a union. We pick back up again from negative 1 to 2 over 9. We have a gap in our graph again, so I have another union, and then we pick back up at 2 over 9 to infinity. So for each value that it does not equal, you need to show that you have a hole in your graph there. So this would be our answer. All right, let's do number 8. So in finding our domain, we have to be careful when we have fractions and square roots. Here we have a square root. What can we not have under the square root? Negative. So I have to set whatever's under the square root greater than or equal to 0. I can ignore everything else in the problem. I'm only looking at what's under the square root. So that minus 7 at the end goes away. The square root goes away. We only care about what's under the radical. And we just set that greater than or equal to 0. Now, how would I solve this? No, we ignore the square root. We only look at what's under the radical. Subtract 5. So 6x is greater than or equal to negative 5. Then we can divide by 6. So x is greater than or equal to negative 5 over 6. So if you need to, write it on a number line just to see. We're talking about x values that are greater than or equal to negative 5 over 6. So that would be numbers that are greater, so to the right. How would I write that in interval notation?
Negative 5 over 6.
Bracket or parentheses? Bracket, because it is a greater than or equal to. So bracket negative 5 over 6 to infinity. Perfect. Remember, infinity always gets parentheses.
Oh, wouldn't it not matter if you do include the square root, because if you just square both sides, it's still 0?
Yes, but I just want to make sure that you don't include the minus 7 too.
These are all.
Yes. All right, let's do number 10. For 10, do I have a fraction? No, I don't have x in the denominator of a fraction. Do I have a radical? No, so what's my domain going to be here? No. All real numbers. How do I write that as an interval notation? Negative infinity to infinity. Perfect. So remember, these are the only 3 cases that you have to look for. If it's none of them, if you don't have x in the denominator fraction, you don't have x inside a radical, and you don't have a fraction and a radical, you don't have them together, then your answer is negative infinity to infinity. You don't have to do any math here. These are the best ones. But for 9, I'll start it for you. We have a radical in the denominator, so we would set what's under the radical, what? What do we do to it? Just greater than 0. Because in our denominator, we can't have it equal to 0. So here I would say 2x plus 5 is greater than 0. We'll have time, so I'll do it. So everything else gets ignored. The top of the fraction, the radical, we don't look at it. We only look at what's under the radical and just set it greater than 0. Now we solve. So what would I do to solve here? Subtract 5. So negative 2x is greater than negative 5. What would I do next? Divide by negative 2. What do we have to remember to do if we divide or multiply by a negative number? Flip the sign. So it goes from being greater than to now less than. So it'd be less than 5 over 2. Don't forget to flip the sign. A lot of people forgot on the quiz. So whenever you multiply or divide by a negative, flip the sign. All right, so x is less than 5 over 2. If you need to, put it on a number line just to see the direction to help you with your interval notation. We have 5 over 2. If x is less than 5 over 2, which direction are we talking about? To the left. So number is smaller, 5 over 2. And it'd be an open circle because it's just a less than sign. So how would I write this in interval notation? Where do we start? Negative infinity to 5 over 2 parentheses. Awesome. And it gets a parentheses because it is an open circle and because it's just a less than sign. So this would be our answer. So for 11 through 14, it says, does the equation define y as a function of x, y, or y not? This is exactly how the directions are going to be on the test tomorrow. It's just asking if it's a function or not. So you just have to tell me if it's a function or not. The wording makes it seem like it's asking for more, but you just have to tell me if it's a function or not. What are the two things that make it not a function? If y has an even exponent, so y squared or y to the 4th power or y to the 6th power, an even exponent, this would be not a function. What else? If y is inside an absolute value, this makes it not a function. So those are the only two things that we'll have to look out for on the test. So for a question like number 11, is 11 a function? No. Why not? Because it's y to the 4th power. So on the test, it's going to ask you why or why not. You just want to circle it. Show me y to the 4th power. That's what makes it not a function. That's perfectly fine. This is as much work as you need here. But just show me why. If you just say not a function or just say no, you'll get half credit because you didn't explain why. Yes? No. For 12, is 12 a function? Yes. So 12 is a function because y has an odd exponent. That's perfectly fine. Odd is okay. And I have no y inside the absolute value. All right. And then for 14, is 14 a function? Why not? Because y is in the absolute value. So again, if you just want to circle it, show me why, or say because We have the absolute value of y. That's fine too. Just show me why not. So let's look at 9. Or, just kidding. 9 is being multiplied. Extra example. This question comes directly from the quiz. Some people had it on their version of the quiz. So here we want to solve, and it's going to ask you to graph it too. Just like how the quiz did. What would I do first to solve? Add 3. So 9 times the absolute value of 1 plus 8x is greater than or equal to 81. What do we do next? Divide by 9. So the absolute value of 1 plus 8x is greater than or equal to 9. What do we do next? We split it. Don't forget to split it. We have 2 answers here. So I have 1 plus 8x is greater than or equal to 9. We keep it exactly the same. The new one, we flip the sign and make the number negative. So 1 plus 8x is less than or equal to negative 9. So we split it. We flip the sign and make the number negative. Now we can solve. So now we want to subtract the 1. So 8x is greater than or equal to 8. Divide by 8. So x is greater than or equal to 1. Yes. We're dividing. So since it's 8x, we divide by 8. It was a plus 8, a positive 8. For the next one, we're going to subtract 1. So 8x is less than or equal to negative 10. Then we divide by 8. So x is less than or equal to, can I simplify negative 10 over 8? To what? Negative 5 over 4. All right, so when I graph these, which one's smaller? Which one's going to go further to the left? Negative 5 over 4. Do I have an open or closed circle? Closed circle. Negative 5 over 4. And then we also have a closed circle at 1. If you need to, you can plug in a number to test to see where you're going to highlight. You can just look at your inequalities here. X is greater than 1, so we're going to be talking about numbers that are greater than 1. And x is less than negative 5 over 4, so we're talking about numbers less than 5 over 4. But you could also plug in a number and test and see if it works. Zero's in between, so plug in a number into the beginning. You can plug in 0, see if it works or not. You'll plug in 0 and you'll see this is not true. So you would highlight outside. We also have to write our interval notation here. How would we write our interval?
Negative infinity to negative 5 over 4
Bracket, and then a u. What would come next? Bracket 1 to infinity. Awesome. So this is part of our answer, this is part of our answer, and these are part of our answer.